Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Promises Part 2 by A.E. Villa, narrated by Aiden Snow. Chapter 1. Quick. Quick slid out of his Range Rover, squinting up at the light breaking through the dawn. He loved this time of the day. Quiet, peaceful, before the hustle and bustle of the laborers in the city began their day. Atlanta in the winter was beautiful to him, January and February being his favorite months. Most of the leaves had fallen from the trees, and as he walked, he enjoyed the loud crunch they made under his black steel-toe boots. He let his long hair hang for a while, the still damp strands sending a pleasant chill through him. Propping himself against the large magnolia tree next to their modest one-story building, he inhaled the smell of nature before it was time to pick up Atlanta's trash. If he still smoked, it'd be a great time to inhale a few drags to calm his mind. But since he didn't, inhaling the big city air would have to do. It was probably just as toxic. He saw that Duke's midnight black F-350 was already in its usual spot, closest to the side entrance. He's here early. His friend had begun to sleep in on some mornings. He'd been on 2 brief vacations, and Quick had lost count on the unscheduled days off Duke now took at will. Duke wasn't only his best friend since they were still young enough to chase tail. He was also his business partner, and almost son-in-law. Yep, they were a typical American family. It had been a couple months since Quick's one and only son confessed his love for his best friend and saved his life by giving one of his kidneys to Duke while he was on his deathbed. Now the two were connected in a way that was immune to destruction and disgustingly sweet. Regardless, Quick was happy for his friend. His son Vaughn had always been a level-headed, determined individual. Though Vaughn was 10 years younger than Duke, he had to admit that they were perfect together. Quick and Duke were both in their early 40s, but the new pep in Duke's step made him look younger and more striking every day. It was about time one of them got their happily ever after. Duke had always been more romantic than him, though. Quick was accustomed to his comfortable, isolated life. He went to work, caught bad guys, kicked ass, hung with buddies here and there, and then went home. Alone. He could do that for the rest of his life. Adding another person into the mix only complicated shit. "Rome, you going to work today or not? Out here sightseeing at nothing?" Duke's deep voice yelled from the open door. Quick threw up his middle finger before pushing off the base of the massive tree and making his way up the bricked walkway. "Can't a man have a few minutes of peace? Not on my fucking dime he can't. Now get in here. We have 2 skips today, and Dana is heading over to Fulton to do a bond." Duke was rattling off the day's business already in full steam-ahead mode. His energy level through the roof at 5 a.m. I wonder why. Quick's steps were heavy along the all-wooden floor. He made a beeline for the still-dripping pot of coffee and poured himself a large cup, not caring about interrupting the flow. He'd slept like shit last night. Although Vaughn hadn't lived with him very long after he returned from law school, he still liked the idea of cooking for 2 again, of sitting on the patio and discussing his day with his son while they drank a few brews. That had actually been pretty cool. But Vaughn had moved in with Duke fairly fast, so Quick found himself arriving earlier for work than usual and was typically the last to leave. Duke was going on about where they were headed, but Quick only had one ear tuned in. His other was on, well, anything besides Duke. He dropped down into his chair and spun until his back was to his friend and he could focus on the serenity of the morning outside the large window. "Should be a clean pickup. Brian and Ford will be here any minute and we'll roll out," Duke finished up, and Quick nodded, still facing the window. He liked going out with the 2 brothers. They were efficient, sharp, and most of all, strong as oxen. It didn't even bother him that Brian had yet to speak a word to any of them, still using sign language as his means of communication. Quick's head jerked up when he heard the door open, expecting it to be the towering brothers. It wasn't. "Vaughn, "What are you doing here?" Quick stood and hugged his son. They'd just seen each other the night before for dinner, but a hug was their customary greeting. Quick looked his son up and down, frowning at his attire. Noting that he was again dressed like a model, not a lawyer. His blue suit matched the light gray dress shirt he wore under a white and gray vest, no tie, and ridiculously expensive gray suede shoes. "Hopefully he's here to see me," Duke said, leaning casually against his office door. Vaughn completely forgot about answering his father and made his way over to his lover. Quick turned away when he saw their lips connect almost violently, cringing at the sounds that emanated from them. "Damn, Duke, don't you have enough spit of your own?" Quick grumbled. The sound of laughter was his okay to turn back around. His son was wiping his mouth, staring at him like he'd ruined the best kiss ever. "I was on my way downtown and thought I'd stop in and—" Vaughn was cut off when the door burst open again, another gust of cool air rushing in along with the two brothers. Since they were going out in the field on recoveries, they wore all black, including thick leather pants and coats to protect them if they had to scuffle with anyone. When you were a bounty hunter, the bail skippers didn't always come willingly. Underestimating how badly someone valued their freedom could result in you being critically injured, or in death. Something Duke had experienced when he was practically beaten to death by some strung-out drug addicts who would rather kill than go back to prison. Duke and Quick had been bounty hunters for almost 25 years. They knew this business, and they were the best. Not only did Duke have his own bail bonds business, but he also did bail recovery for other companies, while their other business partner, Judge, ran the private investigations office. There was plenty of work to go around, and to keep Quick's mind off other things. Quick watched as Duke walked his son to the door, his large hand at his back, his mouth close to his ear. Spinning in his chair again, he noticed that Brian was staring at him with an amused look on his arrogant, handsome face. "What?" Quick barked, knowing Brian wouldn't respond, like always. He got a soft shrug, but no words. Working together for the last few months, they'd quickly become comfortable with each other. Ford came in from their small break room, which consisted of a couple tables, a 42-inch television, a microwave, and refrigerator. Most of them still ate at their desks because they were constantly communicating and exchanging information. Duke was the only one with an office. The rest of them had large desks placed throughout the open space. Dropping down into his large executive-style chair, the mechanisms groaned and squeaked at the sheer weight and bulk of Bradford King. Out of the corner of his eye, Quick saw Brian's hands move in a quick series of gestures, and his brother snorted at whatever was communicated to him. "You sure you're okay with your son dating Duke?" Bradford asked, his grin barely there. "That's a stupid question. Vaughn saved his life. They're in love, case closed," Quick mumbled, still not making eye contact with his colleagues. He fired up his computer so he could have somewhere to direct his attention other than on the speculative glances he kept getting. Brian's hands moved again. If you blinked, you'd miss it. Ford responded. "You're right, Brian." He didn't answer the question. Quick rolled his eyes, but decided to stay hidden behind his monitor instead of delving further into this topic. He wasn't bothered that Duke and his son were together. He was upset because he'd thought he and Duke would eventually be grumpy old men together. It was stupid, but it was the truth. He could admit it to himself, if no one else. When Duke and Vaughn first sealed their commitment, Quick was actually happy. Duke was a damn good man. He knew his son's heart was safe. That's what every parent wanted, right? But some of their long-held traditions began to change pretty quickly. Instead of going out for beer and darts after a hard bust, Duke opted to go home and be with Vaughn, leaving Quick to unwind by himself, or with the King brothers. Duke used to come over for dinner at least 3 or 4 times a week. Now Quick was lucky if he came over once. Who could blame him? Vaughn was an even better cook than him. Duke and he used to laugh at couples who went to dinner parties and game nights with other couples, but now his best friend bragged about being the king of win, lose, or draw among Vaughn's lawyer friends. Friends Quick wasn't asked to meet. Even his internal quarrel made him feel like a jilted bitch. Quick simply needed to find something to do with his free time. Or at least with the time he used to spend with Duke. Chapter 2. Cayson. What is it that you're so afraid of, huh? Did you have a bad experience? You can tell me, then maybe we can work through this. Cayson's voice was shaky when he spoke up again. He wanted to pretend what Joe had just done wasn't degrading and humiliating, but it was difficult to hide his feelings. He couldn't ignore the simmering heat he felt on his cheeks and the sweat beading along his hairline as he picked up the tossed bottle of lube from the foot of the bed. When he'd tried to give it to Joe to get him prepped, the man had damn near thrown up on him before slapping the thin, clear bottle from his hands. No, I didn't have a bad experience. I just don't want to play with your asshole, Cayson. Why is that so hard to understand? Not all men are into anal. Joe was already throwing his legs over the edge of the bed, stuffing his feet into Cayson's leather slippers. Now I've lost my dang erection. Cayson squeezed his eyes shut when Joe closed himself inside his bathroom, slamming the door hard enough to make him flinch. Why do I even bother? Cayson and Joe had been off and on since they'd first met in the OR at Piedmont Hospital 3 years ago. Joe was, and still is, a deeply closeted anesthesiologist. At fucking 42 years old, he was still afraid of his grandfather, a big name in the hospital's administration. Joe had even gone as far as taking a job at a hospital on the other side of town when Cayson started wanting more and had begun winking at him in the halls or in the lab. Now they only saw each other periodically. It definitely was a friends with benefits type of thing, but Cayson always screwed up when he started to want more. Joe would never give him more than what they had. Cayson was his uncomfortable little secret. They typically had a good time between the sheets when Joe relaxed enough. There was a lot of stroking, kissing, and sucking when they got their hands on each other, but Joe still considered it fucking, even though he wouldn't penetrate Cayson, or let him do it. He thought he couldn't be labeled as gay if he didn't actually fuck Cayson in the commonly accepted definition of the word. Frowning again at the absurdity, Cayson stood and began to pull some clothes out of his dresser. He heard the bathroom door open, but didn't bother to turn around. His cock still ached. So did his ass. It clenched in anticipation, only to be rebuffed again. He was so done with this. You said that the last 3 times. Dr. Chauncey, your 3 o'clock is here, his nurse called through his speakerphone. Thanks, Nania. Send him in. Cayson smiled while he straightened a few papers on his desk and closed a couple of strewn files. Duke and Vaughn had become more than just his patients. They were considered friends now, although he was still waiting on his invitation to football night or something. Anything. He thought he knew why they were keeping him at bay for now. Cayson had an overwhelmingly sinking feeling it had a lot to do with Quick. Cayson was the attending surgeon and nephrology case manager for Duke and Vaughn's kidney transplant. He'd been so blown away by the love and dedication the men had for each other that he couldn't resist doing everything in his power to give them a real chance. He didn't think he'd ever worked so hard on a case. It made Cayson believe that miracles were real. If a man as sensual and stunning as Vaughn could swoop in like a comic book hero and save a man like Duke, who was no spring chicken, but gorgeous all the same, then there had to be some kind of hope for a decent human being like himself. He pushed his hand through his dirty blonde hair. He'd been letting it grow a little more on the top since Joe had mentioned that he thought Cayson's longer hair was sexy. Hating where his mind had gone again, he jerked his head up at the sharp knock and the twist of his doorknob, telling the 2 lovers to come in. He stood and came from behind his desk. He hugged Duke first. The contact was strong and sincere. The man didn't look a day over 30. His fit body filled one of the 2 large client chairs as he eased down into it. Cayson noticed Duke's careful movements and made a mental note to ask about it. But first he looked Vaughn up and down, giving him a friendly look of approval. Duke blushed a little when Vaughn sat close to him and ran his hand over his thick mop of black and silver hair, which lay waywardly all over Duke's head. But damn if it didn't work. "So, what have you two been up to?" Cayson smiled, loosening his green and silver necktie. Vaughn grinned and nodded at the gesture, and Cayson just realized that it was the tie Vaughn gave him for his birthday a couple months ago. It was his favorite. With a light chuckle, he smoothed down the silky fabric before continuing looking through Duke's chart. "Work got you staying busy?" "Me, Duke asked, letting the question trail off. Vaughn gave Duke what looked like a reprimanding glare, but the look was returned with heat and passion. Cayson had to loosen his tie a little more as he waited for the two men to have their moment. Vaughn finally spoke up first. "He tumbled down a flight of stairs with a 300-pound man. His ribs took a beating." "How come I wasn't notified about this?" Cayson aggressively fingered through a couple previous pages to see if he missed an ER visit documented in Duke's file, but he hadn't. "You didn't get any x-rays done?" "What the hell, Duke?" "I told you he'd be mad," Vaughn whistled low, giving Duke a look of pity. "Ah, shut up, troublemaker," Duke groused. "On the table, Duke." Cayson got up and went over to the far right side of his office, where he had an exam table and sink. When Duke hesitated, Cayson threw in a forceful, "Now!" for emphasis. "It was just some bruising, no big deal. I've had cracked ribs before. They were way worse than this. Besides, Quick took the real beating. I was on top of the pile. He's the one all fucked up." Cayson's hands froze while lifting Duke's shirt. "Quick? Is he hurt? Is he okay? Did he go to the ER? Duke noticed Cayson's pause, his dark brow raised slightly in amusement. Great. Cayson could feel his face heating. Not now. Anytime Duke mentioned Quick, all Cayson could think about was how he'd embarrassed himself by flirting with an obviously straight stud who was so far out of his league it was ridiculous. Quick had shot him down so fast it made his head spin, and Cayson hadn't fully recovered before he was thrown out of the man's home like the filthy slut his behavior resembled. "You okay, Doc?" Duke asked, reclining on the table and lifting his black t-shirt. Vaughn stood on the opposite side, absently stroking Duke's large biceps with one hand while his other hand flew across the keyboard on his phone. Duke smiled shyly. "Lawyers, huh?" Cayson smiled, but was still distracted as he pressed a few tender spots on Duke's abdomen before working his way over his ribs. Duke was right. They most likely weren't fractured, but the man needed to be careful out in the field. He may look gorgeous, but his body was still its age, and it had taken a hard setback last year. Vaughn and Duke both took great care of themselves and exercised regularly, but he worried about the aggressively physical nature of Duke's work. "Duke, I need you to be more careful, man. If the bruises weren't already healing, I'd have you downstairs getting some images taken, but I'm pretty confident you're just bruised." He palpated a few more areas, which Duke seemed fine with, then told him he could get up. All the other tests and blood work were good on both of them. Life after a transplant could be difficult if you didn't have a good case manager to watch for signs of trouble. It had been almost 9 months since the surgery, and Cayson couldn't be happier with the results. He'd hate for all his hard work to be undone because of a perp who skipped bail. But that was Duke's life. "I promise, Doc. More careful and no more dancing with men bigger than me." Duke pulled his shirt down and climbed off the table. Although Cayson's back was to them, he heard their kiss and whispered promises to each other before they rejoined him. Settling back behind his desk, he tried to play uninterested when he asked, "So, Roman got hurt. Did he see a doctor?" "Yeah, right. Since there were no protruding bones or visible blood, he felt no need. But personally, I think his ribs might be worse off than mine. Stubborn bastard took on 3 men, ignoring my call to pull back." Cayson squirmed in his chair. Thinking of the big bad bounty hunter caused reactions in his body that he had no control over, often leaving him embarrassed and ashamed. But Quick fighting 3 men? That sounded like damn good jerk-off material. There was no denying the exceptional amount of lust that snaked through him when it came to Quick, no other way to describe it. It wasn't love. He didn't know him well enough for that, but it was electric, for sure. Facing Roman, especially going to his home again, wasn't a good idea at all. I would feel more comfortable if he got it checked out. His cheek is still swollen, too. Vaughn nodded, agreeing with Duke. Cayson peered at both of them over his paperwork. I can recommend someone. Quick would never agree to that. I doubt he'll agree to me treating him either. Cayson focused on keeping his expression blank, even though saying that out loud hurt like a bitch. It was how he showed himself, how he shined, by caring, healing. It really was the only thing he was good at. But Quick hadn't let Cayson touch him since he'd stitched up the gash in his arm months ago. Cayson tried to pour as much care into that menial procedure as he could, but Quick had still left the ER without as much as a see you later or I'll talk to you soon. He got nothing but a canceled follow-up appointment. Dr. Chauncey, please go check on him. He's as stubborn as the day is long, but I don't think he'd react the same way he did before. Cayson knew what Vaughn was referring to. He groaned and closed Duke's file, digging the pads of his thumbs into his dry eye sockets. He checked his watch. It was almost 4. Duke was his last appointment, but they didn't know that. He could make up something. Only thing was, he was a terrible liar, and his gut gnawed at him to go check on the big man. He's probably not home, Cayson said quietly, checking his watch. Yes, he is, Duke and Vaughn said in perfect unison. Damn these two. Cayson hadn't been able to resist either one of them since they'd barged into his life. Looking into Vaughn's concerned eyes, he sighed and reached for his intercom button. Nania, are you still there? Yes, doctor, just getting ready to head out. You need something? She sounded tired. Cayson had a hectically full schedule. He was one of the managing board members of the nephrology transplant team in addition to being a well-sought-out surgeon, not to mention the number of hours he volunteered in the ER to let the doctors who had families have some time off. Do we have a radio portable available to check out? His question was met with curious gazes from across his desk while he waited for his nurse to respond. Those things are never available. The hospital only had 4 of the tablet-style portable X-ray radios, so the odds of him... We actually have 2 available, Dr. Chauncey. Do you want me to check one out for you? Cayson cleared his throat in surprise. Yes, please. Thank you, Nanya. You can go home now. Good night, doctor. Cayson stood and began packing a small bag with supplies he thought he'd need from the cabinet behind his desk. He even got a heat wrap. Maybe Quick would let him massage some of the strained muscles he must have. Wishful thinking. He'd grabbed the radio tablet on his way out. I really appreciate this, Cayson. He didn't know what to say to Duke or even how to look him in the eye. Did he tell him how scared he was to face Quick? Particularly an injured Quick? Tell him that he wasn't sure he could control himself or his bodily fluids? His fucked up whatever the hell it was with Joe was becoming increasingly silly and immature. All the humping and grinding made him feel like he was a nervous virgin too scared to go all the way. He needed to be touched, loved, fucked hard up against the wall. Didn't he deserve that as much as the next man? We'll walk you out. Vaughn stood and buttoned his jacket. Cayson watched Duke appreciatively scan Vaughn's entire 6-foot frame before he stood himself. Feeling the warmth from the men in his office, his jealousy was there, riding him, making him edgy, quick to get upset and cop an attitude, because he knew he was deserving of the same treatment Duke was getting. Where the fuck were all the men like Vaughn? Cayson tried to remain calm as he threw a couple files still on his desk into his vintage cowhide messenger bag. He wouldn't act like a ridiculous child with these great men and piss on their picnic basket. He just needed to find his own picnic. He tossed a couple more files in, just in case Quick threw him out on his ass again, giving him time to do some work at home. The thought made him want to change his mind. He was done with the mistreatment. If it meant being alone, so be it, but no more allowing men to walk all over Dr. Cayson Chauncey. There. Oath to self made. Chapter 3. Quick. Quick finished his long shower. He'd let the scalding water beat on his back and side for as long as he could stand it. His ribs screamed in protest any time he turned too fast, squatted, or bent over, and he was beginning to think he may have fractured a couple. His chest ached when he breathed, but again he self-diagnosed, contending it was only tenderness, nothing more. He reached into his top chest drawer and pulled out some boxer briefs, but when he thought of bending twice to put on his underwear and pants, he opted for his thin cotton lounging pants and no shirt. Lifting his right arm, he gingerly touched the black and purple bruises all along his torso. Fuck me. What had he been thinking? What was he trying to prove? Watching Ford and Brian toss men around and beat them like it was a sport had Quick wanting to show off his shit too. He was martial arts trained since he was a teen. 3 fucking men were barely a challenge, but he always had to remember to keep his anger from rising to levels that caused him to act without considering the consequences. He'd taken the first 2, kicking one in the nuts while he held the other in a tight chokehold. Then the third scared bastard had slammed into him from behind, sending all of them crashing down the apartment building's concrete stairs. Those damn steps had to be what had done the most damage to his body. But, still high on adrenaline, Quick ignored Duke's orders and got back on his feet, stomping bodies until he reached their bounty. Now he was home, hiding, because Duke was pissed off at him for taking unnecessary risks, which he no doubt had told his son by now, so he knew without checking what all the missed calls and angry texts from Vaughn were about. It had been almost 5 days since the bust, and he couldn't ignore his son or his best friend forever. However strong he considered himself to be, there was no way he was going back into the field right now. A few more days of recovery were definitely needed. He'd just tied his still wet hair back in a loose ponytail at the base of his neck. Rubbing on a thin layer of deodorant and a little aftershave, he was slowly making his way downstairs when he heard a firm knock on his front door. Oh no, he grumbled, not in the mood for Vaughn or Duke's antics tonight. He frowned when the knock became louder and more persistent. It couldn't be them. They would have used their key after the first knock. He couldn't run down the stairs, so whoever was at the door had better be patient. That thought wasn't even done before there was another knock, more like a banging. "Stop knocking on my damn door like that," Quick shouted from the second landing. He was trying to navigate the short distance between him and the front door, but was moving slowly. Using his leaf blower in the yard earlier today probably wasn't a great idea, but he'd never been one to sit around and wallow in pain. He came from a long line of tough men. His father worked their family farm through every ailment he ever got. So did his grandfather. Surely, Quick could do the same. When he unlocked the bolt, he twisted the knob and was almost knocked back off his feet when he saw Dr. Chauncey, Cayson, standing there on his porch with his large medical bag at his feet. He had on a puffy mid-thigh black North Face parka with a large hood trimmed with tawny brown fur. He looked adorable, all bundled up and rosy-cheeked from the brisk temperature. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to knock like I'm the police. I got a little worried when it took a while. I came, Duke told me. He said maybe I should come by. Totally his idea. I promise I'm not just swinging by. As a matter of fact, I think it's rather rude to stop by unannounced. But Duke said, 'Cayson, Would you like to come in and get out of the cold for a bit? Quick smiled, pulling the door open wider. The man was blabbering like a silly fool, but Quick knew exactly why Cayson.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?